Morning, everybody. Morning. Welcome to part 2 of our Family Systems Basic Workshop. My whole goal with this little 2-part workshop is to give you kind of a basic understanding or a review of family systems thinking, to be helpful to you as you explore your spiritual family tree, which is what we're going to be doing for adult class for this fall. And just to be able to reflect on relationships in your family and how you're a part of them. So, family systems thinking is kind of a lens. It's a way of something you look through that shapes the way that you see the world. Family systems theory recognizes that our families are this complex, dynamic force in our lives, and we're all interconnected in all sorts of different ways. Kind of like a spider web. You touch one part and it affects the whole thing. The way that we relate to the people in our families, our workplaces, our church affects who we are and how we act and function. And the more that we understand those relationships and how they shape us, the more that we can respond in ways that have a positive impact on our families and our own emotional and spiritual health. So, if you weren't here last week, you can watch the video from last week to be able to see what we walked through. And I've also got notes pages over here if you want to be able to take notes, or some extra paper there as well. Starting on September 22nd, we're going to explore our spiritual family trees. This little book is what it's based on, by Barbara Wendland and Larry Easterling. Walks through a process of exploring and then drawing the tree of relationships and events and experiences that have shaped your spiritual journey in faith. You can learn an awful lot about yourself when you look closely at your family and see repeating patterns that of health or unhealth. So, family systems is it's a way of seeing how relationships work. There's all sorts of different systems, of course, like mechanical systems, like a mobile, organizational systems, like a hierarchy or a flow chart, and natural systems that are interrelated, like how our atmosphere and climate and water and land use and ecosystems and what we do as humans has an impact on all of it. So medical and psychiatric professions have started seeing the benefits of using system thinking in their own areas. They've started looking at people's family histories, and this is what's called a medical genogram, to see patterns in their families. And all these scientific discoveries teach us about how we function. So family systems really emphasizes process rather than content. And the family systems approach began with Murray Bowen, who began to see how his patients were affected a lot by their network of relationships, especially their family of origin. And he started doing therapy differently with the whole family rather than just with the individual. Ed Friedman kind of followed up on Bowen and applied those concepts to churches, because churches are essentially a family of families. He wrote Generation to Generation and A Failure of Nerve, which we'll talk more about today. Peter Steinke also followed up on Ed Friedman, took those concepts, applied it even more specifically to congregations. He wrote the last 2 books over there, How Your Church Family Works and Healthy Congregations, to help congregations wade through turmoil or become healthy enough to deal with conflict when it came along. So last week we started looking at the 5 of the basic concepts of family systems that Spiritual Family Trees highlights. First of all, the identified patient, homeostasis, differentiation of self, emotional triangles, and intergenerational repetition. We talked about the first two last time, and we'll talk about the last three today. So, just to review real quick, the identified patient idea is this, kind of stereotypical approach to counseling where you lay on the couch and you tell the therapist all your problems, and they ask, how do you feel about that? Which kind of comes from Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical approach, thinking that it was all about a psychiatrist and a patient digging through the patient's early memories, trying to have this individualistic focus on how do we fix this person's mental problems and symptoms. But then Murray Bowen and others like Ed Friedman started to realize even biologically, problems in any organ can be related to excessive overfunctioning, underfunctioning, or dysfunctioning of another part of the body. And that's the same thing with our lives. He says focusing on symptoms alone or on one dysfunctional part in isolation from the rest of the body only brings short-term relief. The question among people in our network of relationships, like Paul talks about us being the body of Christ, is who has the greatest ability to bring change to the whole system. So the second thing that we looked at last week, was homeostasis. And homeostasis is this idea of balance or equilibrium. It's this natural urge that we have to keep things the same at all costs, to preserve the balance even if it's unhealthy. People get really comfortable with the way things work in their families, these patterns, and they just think that that's just how things are. When somebody, kind of tries to change their behavior and kind of rise above, everybody else pulls them back down and says, what's come over you? You're not yourself anymore. There's all this pressure to conform to the way things always are. And the pressure that builds up in all of our interconnections as a family, kind of like underground pipes, the pressure is our anxiety. And that tends to limit our responses. Every time that you get kind of anxious about a situation, you kind of go back to your knee-jerk reactions. It's like instead of using the thinking part of the brain, you go back to the instinctive part of your brain anytime that you're under stress, strain, or anxiety. But if we're aware of that and recognize that we're in unhealthy patterns in our families, and we can have an effect on them, we can start to recognize that the way that we behave and function can make a difference in the network of relationships. So that's where we ended up last week. Did you have any questions that came up over the course of the week about what we've talked about so far, about the idea of the identified patient or homeostasis, equilibrium?
That kind of limits growth.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a ceiling item.
Right.
And with the counseling thing, when you're one-on-one, you don't always know if the person's not talking. You can't really fix it.
Right.
Like I think
right.
my grandson, he lost a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Who was hit by a car, and I kind of think he's still dealing with that, and he had some counseling. But
Mm-hmm.
Mom said, I don't think she's been talking to counselors. The to look at each other. So
Yeah, or if they're, or they might be, you know, we tend to always put the most positive spin on things for ourselves, and so sometimes we're not as honest. And that's why this family systems approach actually has people all come together. And
yeah, they're all the same. But otherwise, with the HIPAA laws, you can't talk about what the other one talked about, and it's like you never really connect.
yeah, yeah. So being able to see more than one person, and
They need to be all
and
together so they can
exactly,
talk back and forth.
exactly. That brings a whole different dynamic than just trying to figure out
You get the different
your
story
problem.
over here than over there.
Yep, yep. Other questions or thoughts that came from those two ideas of identified patient and equilibrium, maintaining the status quo at all costs. All right, and we're going to jump into our next concept here called differentiation of self. Essentially, that's being able to define who you are in the midst of your relationships. And that's really important for promoting the health of your family or your friendships, both for you as an individual and for your family and friends as a whole. In his book, Generation to Generation, Ed Friedman says, differentiation means the capacity of a family member to define his or her own life goals and values apart from surrounding togetherness pressures. To say I when others are demanding you and we. He says, it includes the capacity to maintain a relatively non-anxious presence in the midst of anxious systems, to take maximum responsibility for one's own destiny and emotional being. It can be measured somewhat by the breadth of one's repertoire of responses when confronted with crisis. The concept should not be confused with autonomy or narcissism, however. Differentiation means the capacity to be an I while remaining connected to the people around you. So this idea of self-definition doesn't mean being real pushy or selfish. It simply means having a self, having a good sense of who you are, what you believe, what you stand for, and how you want to be, how you want to connect with other people. It means being able to define your values and what you stand for while still staying connected to the people around you. It helps you regulate your own anxiety and not just have like a knee-jerk reaction to everything. It helps you respond in more creative ways so that you can see different options and take a clear, calm stand, even at the risk of displeasing others. So one of the ways that you can do that when you're having kind of a firm conversation or an argument with someone is to say, I understand what you're saying, and even kind of repeat back to the person or summarize what you hear the other person saying, but then say, but I see it this way, and you give your perspective on it. It's helpful to not get sucked. The hard thing about this is not letting yourself get sucked into other people's anxiety, and to resist either over-functioning, taking on too much responsibility, too much, doing too much, but also not under-functioning, not just being passive. It's the difference between not doing everything yourself, but also not just rolling over and playing dead by withdrawing or cutting yourself off or just getting by. What are your thoughts about that idea of differentiation of self?
I think parents can kind of influence, I want my child to be a doctor or a lawyer, you know.
Oh, yeah.
The kid just wants to be the garbage collector, you know.
Yeah.
It's a profession, it's like, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So you kind of
And
impose
it's
your wishes on, you know.
right, right.
others.
Yep, we tend to try to define other people, kind of
It's what I
pigeonhole
want
them,
you to be,
you know, put them in a box. And this idea of being a self-defined person, it's not being selfish, like curved in on yourself and me all the time like a little toddler. But it's being able to take a stand, you know, being able to say, this is what I believe, this is who I am, this is what I'm willing to do in this relationship. Yeah.
I think from a Christian standpoint, you know, if you try to direct somebody and not let, you're limiting the Holy Spirit from directing them. You know,
Mhm,
and taking
mhm.
over.
Yeah. When I'm counseling couples that are going to get married, one of the things that I talk about with them about communication is using I language. You know, saying, I think this, or I see this, or I feel this when this happens, rather than you language, which was you always, and you never, and why don't you? It's coming from this, starting with, when this situation happens, when you do this, then I feel this way. It affects me like this. How is that a better approach than using the you language? Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that people get anywhere like just like pointing fingers at people.
Uh-huh.
It's just about like expressing how you feel
Right.
in a situation.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so you're clear
Yeah.
and helping the other person see
Yeah.
your perspective without being pushy.
Yeah, 'cause like nobody gets like, nobody like when you're like accused of something, like when somebody like points fingers at you, nobody's gonna feel like you're getting anywhere.
Mhm.
Nobody's gonna feel like, okay, you know, you're gonna. It's just a lot better communication
Right.
to just express your feelings like gently.
Uh-huh.
You know.
Uh-huh. Yeah, being able to use those I messages kind of helps defuse the situation, whereas you messages kind of just amp up the defensiveness of the other person.
Can we talk about it?
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about this together. Now, it isn't easy to stay connected and yet also be self-defined. Ed Friedman says, if you're a leader, expect sabotage. He says, differentiation, taking a stand on who you are, what you believe, how you're going to function in the relationship, it gets sabotaged by resistance from the system. Whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, whether it's your workplace, your school, whatever network of relationships that you're a part of, when one person tries to make changes in themselves, the rest of the system tries to pull them back in or knock them back down. How have you seen that in
politics and everything.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
politics.
that's really, really
Absolutely.
Strong place.
This is a really good conversation to have in the middle of
Election
the election.
season.
Really, really good.
Yep. Yep. It works that way in political parties, and it works that way in parties that you have with your family. Yeah, it's the system, the emotional network tries to force you back to the way things were, to maintain that homeostasis, that sense of this is the way things always work. It needs to stay the same no matter what the cost. But the cost is too high. So, differentiation involves, as we just talked about, self-regulation, being able to control your anxiety, or at least keep a lid on it so it doesn't just boil over. And it also means regulating, controlling your own responses, the way that you respond in a situation, so that you don't just knee-jerk react, lash out or withdraw or whatever your typical reaction is. Differentiation means being able to have a sense of, here's how I'm going to act, behave in this relationship. And it also is about self-definition, having a clear understanding of who you are and what you believe. It's interesting, Buddhism is all about self-regulation. They try to cultivate this detachment from the world, kind of an inner calmness and peacefulness. Jesus takes a little different approach. He was very self-defined, inwardly and outwardly, but he wasn't afraid of conflict. Our whole sermon series right now is on harsh words that heal, where Jesus so often had these difficult conversations with people, especially with the religious leaders, he wouldn't let anyone get him off track. I think it's the Gospel of Matthew talks about how Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he knew it was waiting for him there, that there was going to be conflict, that he was going to be arrested and tortured and beaten and killed. But he set his face to go there, and he started telling his disciples what was going to happen to him on the way. And Peter said, "God forbid! This cannot happen to you, Lord." You remember what Jesus said in response? "Get behind me, Satan!" He's talking to Peter. "You are thinking about the things of this world, not the things of God." Jesus wasn't afraid to get in people's faces when he needed to. We're called to be in the world, but not of the world. Yeah, what other thoughts do you have about those ideas of self-regulation and self-definition?
Now that I'm by myself and many of others here are here, it was always we.
Yeah.
Who am I? And I need to do the things that we, that your partner took care of, and so you learn how to be an I.
Yeah.
It's another one of those, you're a wife and then you're a mother, and then all of a sudden you have an empty nest, and it's like,
right.
I had a, job. Now what am I? Who am I? What's my new?
Every time we
place
go
here?
through a big change in our lives, we have to kind of rediscover who we are. Yeah, and how we relate with the people around us. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bob.
When Joan died, I had to become a we, because I had to take over what she did,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well as what I already had. So, in a sense, I wasn't I.
Mm.
I had to be a we, and I still am in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, you take on additional roles.
Ironing, washing,
Yep.
dishes, all that sewing, and
Mhm.
all that kind of stuff that she did.
I didn't know you ironed, Bob. I'll be dropping some things
The
off.
ironing board is set to the
I know.
I watch football games, I'll be on your holiday.
Wrinkle-free clothing.
And it's the same thing in other families. whether it's your work family or your school family or your church family. Leaders in whatever system are kind of like the immune system of the organization, the immune system of the congregation. Like, for example, when my first marriage was falling apart, the church leaders there functioned kind of like white blood cells in the body of Christ. Whenever they heard any rumblings or rumors, they told people, you need to talk directly to Pastor Kurt about that. Differentiation means being able to maintain a calm, non-anxious, or at least less anxious, and properly challenging presence. It means not emotionally cutting people off or giving into them and just getting steamrolled by them. It means being comfortable with seeing the other person's point of view, even if it's not the same as yours.
When it becomes liberal and the Christians accept things that years ago we didn't accept, and you try to correct them,
Mm-hmm.
they don't want to hear what you got to say.
Yeah. So it's challenging to want to have a
Stand
good
for
relationship.
What you know that is the truth.
Right.
And they just are kind of just accept it. Oh, love. I hear one lady, love covers everything.
It's true. Yep. But love also instructs. Love also encourages in the right way. So it's vital to really have a good sense of who you are, what you believe, and then be able to communicate that, share that, and be that presence in the midst of those relationships, especially when the other people in the relationship are coming from a different
These are
perspective.
supposedly, born Christians that have been in church all their lives, and all of a sudden, there's
Have gotten shaped by the world.
It's all gray.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
found it, I was raised Catholic, we're allowed to eat on the Bible,
Mm.
not rules takers,
Mm. Yep.
But
Yep.
I found, in my Christian life, if I stick to the Bible and what the Bible says, if I find them in a place where things are going a different direction, there's a line there, there's a fence, and you have to get off that fence and say, am I going to go that way or am I going to follow Christ? What does Christ say about this?
Mm-hmm.
And then you search for that answer and ask for, discernment from the Holy Spirit that you lead you the right way.
Right. Exactly.
It is really difficult to find the right words,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't wanna stop the conversation.
Yep.
So that piece that you said about hearing where they're coming from,
Right.
not to
Not just to say, oh.
right, not to sway or change how you feel, but to truly understand why they have that opinion
Yeah.
helps in two ways. One, it helps you figure out the best approach to sharing a conflicting opinion with them if you really
Mhm.
understand where they're coming from and why they
Mhm.
feel that way.
Mhm.
But if you take the time to listen and have a conversation,
Mhm.
it makes the other person much more receptive to hearing what you have to say.
Absolutely.
So but it's really hard because
Yeah.
rarely are both sides willing to truly calmly share ideas without
Absolutely.
it getting into a fight.
Absolutely. Especially in our polarized society right now.
Do you
No.
think Jesus knew what Peter needed to hear? When
When he said, "Get behind me, Satan."
right. I was like, okay, let's wake you up.
Right.
But he really knew him. I mean,
Yes.
it's his
He'd been
father,
in
like,
they'd been following him for 3 years, and had a real sense of his heart.
Right.
Yep.
He knew what his heart, I mean, God knows what our hearts are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, wow, I mean, he really knew him. You couldn't just say that to him if you didn't
Yeah.
even know.
Yeah. So it's absolutely vital to stay connected with the people in your family, you know, or work family, or school family, or church family, even when you don't agree, even when they rub you the wrong way. And then still be able to define your own goals, values, and faith, and stay on course. Because if the knee-jerk you know, the way that our polarized society, you know, we tend to either fight or flight. Either we get, you know, go at it hammer and tongs with another person, or we kind of retreat, or, you know, completely emotionally cut them off, or even physically cut them off. And neither of those things are healthy. Yeah.
I think that, like, no matter where anybody stands in any type of relationship or opinion,
Mm-hmm.
People are going to have an authentic reason why they are that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even if it doesn't align with you, because, like, no matter who any person is, no matter where you stand, everybody's going to be a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has a different reasoning. Everybody's just a little bit different because they've had different experiences that have shaped them that way.
Yeah.
You know, so it's
Yep.
just about understanding their viewpoint and just like empathy
And
is
their
like a
heart
really important thing
behind
to
it.
like
Yeah.
it's like empathy doesn't have barriers to it, you know?
Mhm, mhm.
And adding a barrier to a relationship is not a good thing. It's about like what relationships are about, like understanding each other and
Mhm.
connecting in that way.
Right.
And,
Right.
yeah.
I think there's also some relationships that are definitely toxic, you know, and
Sure.
you have to know when to retreat from that so it doesn't pin you down. You know,
Right.
you can,
Yep. You have to be able to maintain yourself, and if the other person is like,
you're just not
Drowning.
going to be able to meet.
Marty, would you hit the down button a little bit on?
Sure.
I don't think we have the air conditioning low enough right now. Yeah. Unfortunately, in this broken world, sometimes relationships have to have a real to be able to properly self-define yourself. You may have to set some limits, some boundaries with another
You
person,
people in an
especially if
abusive
they are
situation, you know, you just can't fix it. You just have to.
right. Yep, yep. Most of the time, it is possible to still maintain a relationship, but it might look different. It might be a little more limited in some cases. But if you're able to have a good sense of yourself, define your own goals, your values, and kind of stay on course with that, when you present yourself in a winsome way, people will be drawn to you, especially when you're truly listening to the other person and hearing their heart, so that you can share your own heart. Any other thoughts about differentiation? Yes.
I think a lot of my actions go back with my family.
Yeah, absolutely.
Depends how you were brought up and what you taught. I had two
Mhm.
sponsors. I was all alone, and they were sponsors after I got older. Like my uncle, and I'd like to live at the farm, was in farm. You going out tonight, behave yourself. I mean, they look after you.
Yeah.
And formed how I think.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And,
Yeah, those mentors, those particular strong relationships really help shape who you are. Absolutely.
said many a time in my head, guys, thank God I was brought up the way I was to believe something was true. I went to the free. I've been here for a while, but it does affect me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, let's go on to the next one. This concept is called emotional triangles. So a triangle is in a relationship. Typically involves me, you, and another person or issue. A triangle is the most stable, structure in engineering. That's why you see bridges made up of all kinds of little triangles, and that's true in our relationships as well. Typically, it starts with some unresolved tension between, or anxiety, or conflict between two people, and they're feeling uncomfortable with that, and so what they do is they triangle in someone or something else. Friedman puts it this way in Generation to Generation. When any two parts of a system become uncomfortable with one another, they will triangle in or focus upon a third person or issue as a way of stabilizing their own relationship with one another. So being triangled means getting caught in the middle as the focus of an unresolved issue between two other people. For example, like if tension between a husband and a wife, they might bring one of their mothers into the argument, or because triangling, bringing that third person or an issue, it can be an issue that suddenly they kind of dredge up or whatever. It kind of serves to stabilize the one person's position and shift the anxiety, the stress between you and the other person somewhere else. So that way, you don't have to make any changes to yourself. You're getting the focus somewhere else. Friedman says, it's been said what Peter says to you about Paul tells you more about Peter than it does about Paul. In an emotional triangle, what Peter says to you about his relationship with Paul has to do with his relationship with you. The reason he's telling you about Paul is because there's something going on between the two of you that he wants to, bring in. When a relationship between two people is stuck, it's probably because there's a third person or issue that's part of that homeostasis that keeps everything locked in place. The harder that you try to fix someone else's problem, the more stress you tend to take on yourself. You kind of get sucked into this triangle and end up reinforcing the situation. And emotional triangles tend to interlock with each other. This is a family tree that you can see that there's conflict, the little red little red jagged lines between people, or they're fused with one another. That's what the deep red line is. And then there's better relationships in green. And then you can see these people are a lot of times involved in more than one triangle. And so those relationships interlock and even make it even more difficult to change. For example, husband and wife fighting over money. That might be one triangle. There's conflict between the two of them, and they're focusing on the money. That's the real problem, but it's only keeping things the same. And the relationship then with the mother-in-law, with her own marital and parental trouble. Or father-in-law.
Yeah.
Change to whatever fits. We're all all part of these complex families. Like the mobile. You touch one part and the whole thing moves. But it always tries to come back to its stasis. Unless you hang a weight on one area, and suddenly that pulls it into different alignment. The most triangled position, so the person who in the system is in the middle of the most triangles is in the most stressful position in the family, or the system. But that person can also be the most influential. So one side of an emotional triangle tends to be more conflicted than the others. It's usually there's more anger, resentment, whatever between two people. But depending on what happens in the relationship, that can switch. Suddenly the anger gets directed towards the other person or issue in the triangle.
Is this President Bush's family?
Yes, actually, it is. Good eye. Yeah, so
I see
George
Walker Bush.
Herbert Walker Bush there, Prescott Sheldon Bush, Dorothy Walker. This is. I just lifted this slide from a whole long presentation about the Bush family. Apparently. So the upside of triangles is that you can only change a relationship to which you belong. Cutting yourself off never fixes the problem. It just makes it fester. It's way more healthy to stay connected in whatever way is feasible, but stay well defined and as non-anxious or less anxious as possible. That way you have a more objective perspective on the situation. And you're trying to avoid taking on the responsibility for somebody else's relationship with the other person or the other issue. Yes?
The blue highlighting I see did not work outside the home. What does that have to do with any of that? Any of the relationship stuff? I don't understand that.
We don't have time to get into the whole
Yeah, I was like, what?
dynamics of the Bush family. This is just all about looking at the patterns in your own family, your own relationships, and seeing how is it that you are affecting the people around you, and how are you being affected by them. One of the most challenging things in being self-defined, differentiated from others, is not taking on responsibility for someone else's relationship with another person or that other issue. It's not your relationship. It's not your responsibility. You need to have a sense of, here's who I am, and here's what I believe and stand for. And I'm going to communicate that in a respectful, honest, less anxious way, and not just get pulled back into the old way of over-functioning or under-functioning. What other insights or questions do you have about that idea of emotional triangles? Again, this is just a very preliminary, early introduction to all this. Some people spend their entire lives working through and coming to a clear understanding of this idea. Because we're all works in progress. None of us have relationships figured out perfectly. All right, the last one to talk about of these 5 concepts is intergenerational repetition. The whole idea of the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. Kind of like you were talking about. You were shaped by these relationships, particular mentors, particular people in your family that had a big influence on you, and friendships and so forth. Families, Friedman says, actually this is in this book, Spiritual Family Trees. The authors talk about how families tend to repeat behavioral patterns and feelings from one generation to the next, especially if these patterns go unexamined. Yeah, absolutely. You see patterns of health and patterns of unhealth in our families. Yep, addictions, which is, kind of bringing in another substance into the relationship because of something that's broken.
I got killed in the McCoys.
Yep.
Still today in the South.
Oh, yeah.
That's Civil War in the South.
Yep.
Hatred
And it's
against them.
between countries and ethnic groups. All these behavioral patterns, these behavioral feelings, they get passed on from one generation to the next, unless we actually take the time to think it through and look at it closely and ask questions about why is it that we always react this way? Why is it that we don't talk to that whole side of the family? Why is it that there's always this conflict between me and this other person? And a lot of times it goes back to stuff that we learned when we were young. Yeah.
It's also patterns of like occupations, like
Yes.
farmers, doctors,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
pastors.
So some of the patterns, some of those things can be healthy. That used to be the way things were. If your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your mom was a nurse, you became a nurse. There was kind of this stability among families, and that has gotten a lot more fluid in our culture today. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of a good thing that like kids are really discovering like who they are and who they want to be, and
Right.
not being as influenced by who their parents were. Like that's a good thing, I would say.
Yep, absolutely. Having a better sense of your own desires and how you're wired and what your passions are and so forth, and not just being limited to, this family, everybody does this. So it can be healthy. Some of these patterns can be healthy, some of them are not healthy. And it's so important to ask the questions about why are things the way that they are in this family, in this relationship. When we ask good questions, that opens up things for us to see things differently and for others to see things differently. This is nothing new. Way back in Exodus chapter 20, God said, "I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." That the sins of the parents often trickle down and affect the relationships down the line. God also says in Numbers 14, "The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means he will clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation." But then in Ezekiel, the Lord says, "Everyone belongs to me, the parent as well as the child. They all belong to me. The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. I will judge each of you according to your own ways." Repent, turn away from all your offenses. Then your sin will not be your downfall. Rid yourselves of all the offenses you've committed and get a new heart and a new spirit. Why will you die, people of Israel? For I take no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the sovereign Lord. Repent, turn back to me, and live. So we see specific patterns of behavior repeating themselves in families. Think about the people of Israel. Abraham tried to tried to pretend that his wife was his sister when he went down to Egypt, and ended up getting himself in all sorts of trouble because of that, because he was trying to not, get himself in trouble, get himself killed. And then his son later on did the same thing, tried to pretend that his wife was his sister to avoid, patterns of unhealth tend to replicate themselves in our families. We tend to make the same mistakes that our parents did. We learn how to function and to relate to others by watching them. And so we unwittingly reinforce the patterns by copying them or by doing the exact opposite. You see that in families too. I'm not going to be like my parents, I'm going to do this. And so they go off the rails in the other direction. So what questions or insights do you have about this idea of intergenerational repetition?
Is it okay sometimes to say that you have to have an original?
Yeah,
For instance, I have a friend who asked you to come stay with me one night. She was living in house because he was being abusive in every way to the children.
right.
So we went to the church.
Mhm.
The Bible study went on. So the Bible study was always enough to talk to the pastor. His advice to me was, you need to go back and make that right. You need to go back and straighten it out. And I'm like, put your child back in the position. He didn't ask what the position was even. He just was going to throw it right back into it. It just wasn't a healthy situation.
Yeah. Yep. Sometimes a relationship can be so toxic, unhealthy, that you have to draw real clear boundaries.
Right.
And those boundaries will be different depending on the relationship. Yeah. Sometimes it means ending it entirely. But when you do that, you have no way of impacting the other person anymore.
Yeah, that kind of goes with divorce, and in history I learned that a big reason why there was such a split between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church was because of their stance on that.
No.
And I think that in a perfect world there would be no need for divorce at all. But some relationships are so some marriages get so toxic and so bad that what's right for you and what's right for your kids is not to continue that.
Yeah.
And that's for safety reasons, really.
Yeah. I heard you
That's
better
really
worse,
needed.
but the child didn't. The child didn't.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
And yourself too.
Relationships are complicated and messy. And so we have to really have a clear sense of who we are so that we can better be present, in a positive way in all of our relationships. And these relationship systems are the same everywhere across cultures, businesses, and churches. All these different human relationships have the same sorts of processes and problems. Secrets tend to divide a family. They provide false companionship. They distort perceptions and make other problems worse by raising anxiety levels. Sometimes you come to a particular point in your relationship where there's a crisis that happens. And a crisis, the word crisis comes from the same root word as scissors. Because there's a moment for decision where there's two paths and one is cut. You're taking the other. Yeah, exactly. Yep, a fork in the road. Another thing that can be really toxic in relationships is an too much seriousness. I'm often guilty of that. That if you're just serious all the time about in your relationships, that ends up producing like these kind of anxiety fumes. Friedman talks about it this way. He says, seriousness can be destructive. It's more than an attitude, it's a way of thinking embedded in constant chronic anxiety. It's characterized by a lack of flexibility of response, a narrow repertoire of approaches, persistent efforts to try harder, an inability to change direction, and a loss of perspective and concentrated focus. He said, families that evidence such seriousness are as if surrounded by volatile fumes of anxiety, and any small incident can cause a flare-up. The antidote to seriousness is the capacity to be playful. Not just, like jokey, but being able to it has less to do with, comebacks than it does with the ability to distinguish process from content. It's more connected with responsibility for others than just being lighthearted. It's kind of like the idea of being paradoxical when you're trying to affect your relationship with that other person. So kind of just jar things a little bit so that suddenly you start to see things a little differently.
Like what Martha has talked about when she was teaching students and somebody was doing something they couldn't, and you tried to kind of diffuse it with humor, and that helps a lot with kids.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, because it can kind of get you out of the funk that you're in. And it's a little bit of playfulness can be really helpful in our relationships, especially when we're kind of locked. Friedman says, when a relationship is in a skid, we almost never think to turn the wheel the other way. So one of the most helpful things is to develop a repertoire of possible responses, to be adventurous and imaginative in your relationships. All right, we are out of time. So what I want to challenge you to do is think about how you can apply these insights in your life. How can you learn to see these patterns in your own family? What I'm going to be encouraging us to do in coming weeks here is to map out our own spiritual family trees. The events, the people, the experiences that have made you the way that you are, and be able to kind of draw it out as a way of sharing it with others. So next Sunday, I'm going to share my own spiritual family tree, and I'll encourage you to draw out and share your own with the group if you'd like over the next few weeks. So next week I will bring a handout that gives a bunch of different questions that you can ask. to be able to start thinking through and drawing what your journey with Jesus has looked like and how it's been affected by the people and the events and the experiences. So thanks. Have a wonderful rest of the day.